Welcome back, A-Pushers. Today I've got a video on 1920s immigration. This goes aligned with topic 7.8 of the College Board CED. Look at that bottom right key concept there. College Board's asking you to know that after World War I, nativist campaigns against some ethnic groups led to the passage of quotas, specifically the Emergency Immigration Act or Emergency Quota Act in 1921 and the Immigration Act in 1924. So the passage of quotas that restricted immigration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe. So that would be the new immigrants coming around the 1880s onward. And it increased barriers to Asian immigration as well, which we already know the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 is in play, but these quota acts will further impede immigration from Asian countries as well. Nativism is a continuity in U.S. history and honestly a continuity in most nations' histories. Sadly, you have this situation where native-born people, even though their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were likely immigrants themselves, feel that because they are native-born, they have a greater right and privilege and entitlement to have their values, their rights prioritized above anybody else's, especially immigrants. And it also usually goes hand in hand with hatred or antagonism towards new immigrants. So that continues in this era, and it actually has quite of a high point in the 1920s. Who's the target of these nativist sentiments? It's the Southeastern Europeans. This is nothing new. You guys already know this. But starting around the 1880s, a new wave of immigrants, mostly coming from that southeastern area of Europe, are going to be coming into the United States. There's some qualities about them that are perceived to be less desirable. Contributing even more to these nativist sentiments is a fear of communism, the first Red Scare. The second Red Scare is going to come after World War II, but this first one is after World War I. Its origin sort of starts during the war, right? In 1917, with that original revolt against Tsar Nicholas II, and then a couple of months later with the Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin taking over and creating that Soviet communist Russia. There's fears now that Soviet communist influences will come with these Southeastern Europeans to the United States and start to affect the culture and society and economy here. So did the Red Scare actually tangibly change people's lives? Did the paranoia really have an effect in America domestically? Yes, it did. And a great example is the Palmer raids, taking place from about November 1919 to January 1920. Attorney General Palmer had targeted raids in New York, Chicago, Detroit, a lot of places where there was heavy labor union presence. They end up arresting thousands of people in these raids and deporting at least 500 of them without any evidence of wrongdoing, especially those who were Southeastern European immigrants. Nativists had many legal victories when it comes to getting legislation to restrict immigration during this era. And now the 1917 Immigration Act is going to put some specific restrictions to even further limit immigration. It's going to target Southeastern Europeans and people from Asia. One of the limitations is a literacy test. If you're 16 or over, you're going to have to pass a literacy test. It could be in your own native language or English, but you're going to have to read at least 30 to 40 words and pass that element of the test. If you don't, of course, you're denied entry to the United States. The Asiatic barred zone element of this is if you're from within areas of Asia, you're likely barred from entry. Now, Japan was excluded because the gentleman's agreement was already in place, and the Philippines was excluded from this because, well, they were a U.S. territory at the time. It also included standards for health, mental health, physical health, and morality, as seen in Mary Creason's immigration documents in Ellis Island in the 1920s here. She said she is not a polygamist. She said she is not an anarchist. Both very good answers if you want to be allowed entry into the United States at this time. An even bigger deal than that 1917 Immigration Act would be the 1921 and 24 quota laws. So the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 is going to take the 1910 census. If you don't know what a census is, every 10 years, the government's going to count all the people that are here in the United States, right? So they take that 1910 census, they look at how many people from every nation are already living here in the US, and they set a quota of 3% for future immigration on an annual basis. In other words, if there's, 100 people from a particular nation here already, only 3 can enter next year. Only 3 from that nation could come the year after that and the year after that. So it's a annual quota set on immigration. Now, if you think about it, who's already here in big numbers? Well, North and Western Europeans. So it didn't really affect them so much. But who is still coming in big numbers? Southeastern Europeans. So there's not as many of them here already, which means the quota will be lower. To get an even more drastic effect, 3 years later, a second Immigration Quota Act is passed. It's also known as the National Origins Act. This is going to lower the quota to 2% only, and it's going to go even further back to 1890 census. 1890? At that point, there's even less Southeastern Europeans present. So this is clearly targeted at that Southeastern European group of immigrants. Canadians were not included, and anyone from Latin America was not included in these quota acts. So there will still be a large number of people from Canada and especially Latin America coming into America at this time. The bar graphs here show the story as well, where you see in 1907 to 1914, you principally have all these Southeastern Europeans coming in, and then the dynamic switches as soon as that Quota Act takes effect. And you're once again seeing more of those North and Western Europeans coming in. Another major term to know is the case of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. These two were Italian immigrants that were arrested and convicted on charges of robbery and murder. They allegedly killed 2 people, a security guard and a payroll clerk at a Massachusetts shoe factory. Now, what makes this case so famous is that the trial was a huge miscarriage of justice. The judge was openly biased against them and would say things outside the court about them that were clearly showing bias. The jurors would do the same. And key witness testimonies were ever changing throughout the trial and afterwards even. So it should have been a mistrial, and this is going to cause protests throughout the nation and even worldwide in big cities like London. Sacco and Vanzetti are ultimately executed in 1927. The big takeaway here is that this case provides a very representative example of xenophobia and nativism causing a terrible miscarriage of justice for Southeastern immigrants. You'll also need to know that the KKK has a resurgence in the 1920s, well, actually about a decade before, but it picks up to this heightened state in the 1920s. One of the primary recruiting factors that plays into the boom in membership is the release of a movie in 1915 called The Birth of a Nation. This was based off of a book called The Klansman, and it paints the KKK as heroes of the South, protectors of order, protectors of American virtue and value. In this second coming of the KKK, they are no longer exclusively anti-African American. They are now, I guess, equal opportunity haters. They are anti-immigrant now too, but anti-anything that's not considered American to them. The most notable event involving the KKK here would probably be the 1925 March on Washington, where over 35,000 KKK members marched in broad daylight down Pennsylvania Avenue. It happens again in 1929, but to a lesser extent. This is alarming because this hate group is publicly unveiling themselves to some degree, and their influence through continued intimidation and violence is very present in the 1920s. So ultimately, what did you need to pick up from this video? That nativist backlash happens in the 1920s. What is it a backlash to? This massive wave of immigration that started really in the 1880s of Southeastern Europeans. Thank you again for your time and for listening. Have a great rest of the day.
I just want to sing your name.